Hello everyone. In the last class, we discussed about different approaches of policy monitoring. Okay, primarily we discussed the social system accounting and social experimentation. Okay, and today we'll be discussing the social auditing and the research and practice synthesis. Okay, so along with this, we'll be also discussing some of the core concepts that we are using for policy monitoring, along with the techniques appropriate for these four approaches that are used for monitoring. We'll be discussing. Okay, so given this outline, now we can move to discuss what is this social auditing. Okay, so what is this social auditing? Before discussing this social auditing, we must understand that what is the benefit of using social auditing. Okay, because we discussed about four different approaches of policy monitoring. The first one that we discussed is the social system accounting, and the second one is social experimentation. But there are limitations to these two approaches. What are the limitations? That both the methods, they neglect or oversimplify the policy processes. Okay, but if you consider the third one, the social accounting, so it partly overcomes these limitations by emphasizing the detailed monitoring. Okay, so that means in social auditing, we explicitly monitor the relationship among the different policy variables like your inputs, processes, outputs, and also impacts. Okay, so for example, through the social auditing, we try to trace the policy inputs from the very beginning to the end. Okay, so from the endpoint to endpoint, okay, detailed analysis and monitoring is included in social auditing. Okay, so that means from the point at which the policy inputs are dispersed to the point at which they are experienced by the ultimate intended recipient of those resources. Okay, so that is the reason we can find that the social auditing system is a better one, because it partly overcomes the limitations that are faced by either by the social system accounting and social experimentation in terms of their negligence or oversimplification of the policy processes. Okay, so in this case, generally when we say that the policy inputs are initiated, okay, so that means where the issues are identified, okay, so there from there only we monitor, right, to how the issues are still there, or the how the issues are being addressed. Okay, because it is through the policy monitoring, and policy monitoring happens during the policy implementations. Okay, and this process continues till the end point. Till the end point means how the changes are occurring right after the policy implementation. Okay, so this is how we can find that how the changes are being happening because of the implementation of this policy through the policy inputs, right, and the ultimate intended recipients of those resources are also monitored, that to what extent they are getting benefited. Okay, so that is the reason it is known as social auditing, so which traces on the policy inputs from the beginning point to the end point. Okay, and moreover, the social audit also helps in determining whether the policy outcomes are because of the policy inputs. So many times we are finding that outcomes are the functions of the policy inputs. Okay, so if there is any problem associated with the policy input, or there is faulty design in the policy inputs as well, or processes as well, then outputs that are expected may not be achieved. Okay, so that is the reason by taking the lens of the policy social audit framework, we can find out, or we can determine whether the policy outcomes are the consequences of the policy inputs, that is inadequate policy inputs, or results of the processes that may divert the resources or services from the intended target groups and beneficiaries. Okay, so this also we can find out through the social audit systems. And moreover, in monitoring the policy processes, this particular social auditing system, it provides very important information about what is happening within the processes, because within the processes is taken as a black box that is not known very clearly, right? But when the social auditing framework is adopted, the monitoring happens through the policy processes as well. So through this we can also find out what is happening inside the black box. So that is another benefit of social auditing, okay, because it can provide some more information about the processes as well. And if you see the processes that are monitored in the context of a social audit, so they can be of two main types. The first one is the resource diversion and the second one is resource transformation. Okay, so this is resource diversion and the second one is resource transformation. Okay, so now let's discuss about the resource diversion and resource transformation, right? So far the social audit framework is concerned for monitoring. So what is this resource diversion? Okay, so before discussing what is resource diversion, now let's take an example, then we will be discussing what is that. Suppose say that there is a fund, okay, there is a fund which is especially meant for afforestation program. Okay, so this is a real life context. So there is a fund called CAMPA, right? Right. So the funds that is available in this is only utilized for the afforestation program. Okay, and suppose say there is some emergency or something happening, and that is the reason in an immediate time the policymaker cannot find out that how to identify the funds so that they can utilize in those emergency cases. Okay, so that is the reason what they have done, or what they are intending to do is that since there are some amount here, right, so they can divert these resources for this immediate expenditure. Okay, so that is known as the resource diversions. So this particular case has already happened during COVID-19, right? So when there was scarcity of fund in order to tackle the COVID crisis, so many state governments, so they try to utilize the funds which were remaining unutilized under this CAMPA, and they utilized for treating COVID-19 crisis. Okay, so that is called the resource diversion. So now after understanding this particular example, now we can understand what could be the definition of the resource diversion. Okay, so in resource diversion, the original inputs are diverted, right, from the intended target groups. So intended target groups is here, right, afforestation program in some locality or in a state, and the beneficiaries would be again the citizens of that particular state or locality, and as a result of passage of resources through the administrative system. So here the administrative systems are the local administrative systems and the state or district administrative systems. Okay, so the original inputs are diverted basically from the intended target groups or beneficiaries, right, to some other groups, right, or other options, and this transfer happens, or this diversion happens through the administrative systems only. Okay, and the second one is resource transformation. Okay, what is this resource transformation? So here the resources and the actual receipt, right, actual receipt by the target groups may be very identical, and they may mean that these resources to some of the staffs and the target groups may be altogether different as well. Okay, so here the highlight is that although the resources that are being received by different target groups may be identical, right, but the same resources, right, the way it is being transformed from inputs to, let's say, outputs or outcomes, right, so they can be altogether different for the program staffs and other targets groups. Okay, so that is resource transformation. So for example, if we have the resources or inputs, okay, so that we are utilizing, let's for the transportation system, right, for transportation system in terms of roadways, okay, or waterways. Okay, so here what is the resource transformation? The resources is in terms of your budgetary allocation, let's say physical units and monetary units. Okay, physical units and monetary units, now they are being transformed, right, into the outputs like infrastructure in terms of the roadways, road networks and water networks. Okay, so what is happening is that these resources, so if you see the definition again by getting this example, then resource transformation is nothing but resources and their actual receipt by the target groups may be identical. So here these resources that is received by the target groups like the stakeholders, so may be identical because every stakeholder will be exposed to the same network, same transportation network or same roadways and the waterways. Okay, but for the program staffs and other target groups, right, this is altogether different because the initial resources in terms of physical allocation of resources or budgetary allocation of resources in terms of monetary units, now they will be altogether changed from these physical and monetary units to some outputs like your networks, road networks or water networks. Okay, so that is the reason we can say that this resource transformation also needs to be monitored, and this monitoring is happening through this social audit. Okay, and so if the meaning of these resources are becoming different for different persons, then the resources may have been transformed in such a way that it will be changing its impact on the beneficiaries. Okay, so that is the reason you can think about that how these resources that is being now utilized or available to these beneficiaries would be in a different form, right? So that means some would be interested to use this particular road networks in order to manifold its livelihood options, right? Or some may be interested to carry forward, use it for health related uses, like now because of this connectivity issue, now you can find that some of the person can commute well from one hospital to another hospital, right, or from their locations to a better healthcare facilities. Okay, so that may also happen. So this is the meaning of resources in fact different because then the resources may have been transformed in such a way that it can change their impact on the beneficiaries as well. Okay, and for this reason, if we want to see the monitoring aspect of these resources, that how resources are going to be monitored through social accounting, then I don't think that it is only the quantitative methods which will be adequate. Rather, in addition to the quantitative methods, we need to also take into account the qualitative methods. So, quantitative methods may be in terms of what? How many kilometers of road networks and water networks are being built, right? So, that is your quantitative method for monitoring how inputs are converted into outputs. But simultaneously, we have to also take into account the qualitative methods or qualitative aspects of this conversion of inputs to output, that how people from different categories or different beneficiaries are getting benefited. So, maybe it is in terms of how they are commuting from their home to offices and how their duration of commuting is getting decreased, okay, from let's say 1 hour to 30 minutes, right? Or you can think that how the business of or livelihood aspects of some stakeholders are also multiplied because they can have access to nearby locations for their business trips. Okay, so in that way we have to capture the qualitative aspects as well. So in social audit we have to take into account the quantitative aspects or quantitative methods in addition to the qualitative methods. Okay, so the social experimentation and the quantitative measurement can be successfully combined with the social auditing, and the qualitative research on the policy processes can also be an indicator for monitoring purpose as well. Okay, so based on this understanding about our social auditing and social experimentation that we have already discussed, right? So now we can find that social auditing and social experimentation, right, require collection of new information about the policy actions and policy outcomes. So what are the new information we are requiring? So for social auditing, for example, the new information are what are the qualitative changes that happen because of the policy implementation, right? Or what are the quantitative aspects or quantitative changes happen because of the policy implementation. Okay, so social auditing captures or requires the collection of these new informations about the policy actions and policy outcomes. So, the same is the case for the social experimentation. So, both these monitoring approaches require the collection of new information about the policy actions and policy outcomes. Okay. And if you see these two approaches in comparison to the social system accounting, so the social system accounting is primarily based on the existing information. Okay. Although it requires new data or new information, but its relevance is based on the available information only. Okay. But if you see the research, the last approach in the policy monitoring, that is research and practice synthesis. Okay. So it is, so this particular approach is quite detailed, right? Because it takes into account the inputs from different sources or multi-source information is taken into account, right? In order to see that how the policy inputs and policy processes are impacting the policy outputs. Okay, so in a sense you can say that this research and practice synthesis, right, is a core policy monitoring approach that integrates the multiple empirical studies and evaluations and also the practitioners' knowledge which were not available, but right now through this research and policy synthesis we try to pull or collect all these in order to monitor the policy inputs and processes as well. Okay. So, based on this understanding that this research and practice synthesis pulls information from different sources, right? So, this research and practice synthesis, it involves the systematic compilation of data, right, or information. Then it also systematically does a comparison among the existing sources. Okay, so that means these are the new sources in fact. Okay, and assesses the results of the past efforts, that how past efforts gets implemented in terms of public policies. Okay, so the basic thing in research and practice synthesis is that it has been used to synthesize the information in a number of policy issues, right? So we can find the applications in a varied areas, like it can range from the social welfare, education, health, municipality services, science and technology, innovations, and so many other aspects as well. So research and practice synthesis tries to synthesize information in a number of policy contexts. Okay, and so this particular approach has already been employed to assess the quality of policy research that are already conducted on the policy processes and also policy outcomes. Okay, so based on this understanding, now we can focus on what are the different sources of available informations for this research and practice synthesis. Okay, so basically we can identify two primary sources where we can get the information, right, which can be relevant to our research and practice synthesis. So which are these two primary sources of information that can be used in the case of our research and practice synthesis? So the first one is through case studies, and the second one is through research reports. Okay, so there could be specific case by case studies related to the policy formulation and policy implementations, and we need to take into account all these case studies, right, based on some indicators or some identifiers or some classifications. Okay, and the second one is through research reports. So the research report try to address the relations among the policy actions and the policy outcomes as well. Okay, so now we can take the first case, that is case studies of the policy formulation, because these are the two primary sources for getting the available information for our synthesis. Okay, so if you are going to take the case survey method, so that means the research and practice synthesis is applied to the case studies, and it may be based on what is known as case survey method. So if let's say we want to find out what are the policy outcomes, right, policy outcomes of policies related to groundwater, limiting the groundwater extraction. Okay, so for that, if you are taking into account a case survey method, then we have to identify that how many case study or case surveys are existing, and where are these are they existing, and what are the targets so far this policy is concerned, that is limiting groundwater extractions. Okay, so we are trying to classify that how many case studies are there and where they have already been conducted and what are the impacts and outcomes. Okay, and along which what are the different processes and inputs they adhere to in order to achieve these impacts or outcomes of these policies. Okay, so that is known as the case survey method, case to case. Let's suppose say that Haryana government has already undertaken or Rajasthan government has already undertaken that what is the policy implication of the limiting groundwater extraction. Okay, so that means we are now identifying these studies, right, case by case basis and try to synthesize through the lens of or through the framework of research and practice synthesis. Okay, so I think it is now clear that what is this case survey method. So basically this case survey method is a set of procedures that are used to identify and analyze that what are the factors that may account for the variations in the adoptions and implementations of the said policy, and here the example is the limiting groundwater extraction. Okay, and in this case survey method there are some requirements. Okay, so this survey method requires that the analyst first develop a case coding scheme. Okay, so what is this case coding scheme? Case coding scheme is a set of classification or categories that captures the main aspects of policy inputs, the policy processes, outputs and also impacts. Okay, so all these classifications are coded. Okay, and for every cases, so these frameworks, right, coding framework is applied. Okay, so in case of some other case studies like case surveys which focus on primarily the public agencies or let's say private corporations, so in that case the case surveys try to determine what are the factors that are responsible for successful or unsuccessful efforts for the implementation and utilization of the management innovations or the implementation of the said policies. Okay, so here we can take the example of the case coding scheme. So what is this case coding scheme? So as I told you that it follows some classification mechanisms based on some indicators. So here we can say that what are the type of indicators that we have to take into account. It may be in terms of input, process, output and impact. Okay, so for input, what are the indicators that can be taken? Let's say adequacy of resources. Okay, and what would be the coding categories? The coding categories could be that what is the adequacy of resources. If it is the indicator, let's say that we can go back to our example of limiting groundwater resources. Okay, so and we identified that there are 3 studies undertaken at 3 subnational or state level. So we try to analyze those case studies based on this indicator, adequacy of resources. Okay, so saying that let's say it is the case of Haryana, right? So we are categorizing or coding whether in Haryana the groundwater is totally adequate or mostly adequate or not at all adequate. Okay, so we are categorizing, right, and we are coding. Let's say it is mostly adequate. Okay, so we are going to the other case studies that is already available. Let's say it is for Rajasthan. Okay, so again here we are trying to find from this case that what is the adequacy level of this groundwater. So we are finding that it is not at all adequate. So accordingly we are coding these case studies, right, through different categories. Okay, so this is for the input. Okay, that how the resources, what is the status of the resources, whether there is adequate resources available or not, and accordingly what is the policy prescriptions for it or what is the policy intervention and what is the processes and impact of this policy implementation, that is limiting the groundwater extraction. Okay, so likewise we can think about multiple of policy cases. Okay, and through this case coding schemes where we can take the indicator like processes. For example, we can take the indicator through this processes is involvement of administrative staffs in defining that particular problem, and the categories or coding categories that we can use for this indicator can be that these staff, they can make decisions or they can influence decision or they cannot influence the decision. Okay, or they can think about that there is high level of information or insufficient information available, or moderate level of information or low level of information available so far the utilization of results of policy research is concerned. Okay, so likewise for all these types of indicators we have to identify the model indicator for it, right, and accordingly we can categorize based on their statuses or codes. Okay, and after doing it, then we can think about that, let's say that in this monitoring approach, that is research and practice synthesis, let's say we are using or applying this approach, right, to the available research reports, then it is based on the research survey. Okay, so research survey or research synthesis or evaluation synthesis. So when the research and practice synthesis is applied to the available research reports, then it is called that it is based on research survey. Okay, so what is this research survey, right, because we mentioned about the first one is our, what is that, the case survey method, and the second one that we are discussing is the research survey method. So that means in addition to the case survey method, so the research practice and synthesis also relies on another source of information, so that is based on the research reports. And when the research and practice synthesis is applied to the existing research reports, then it is based on the research survey, okay, or which is also known as research synthesis or evaluation synthesis. So what is this research survey? So again, this research survey is a set of procedures that are commonly used to compare and appraise the results of the researches that have already been commenced and completed, right, and based on the policy actions and policy outcomes. So these research reports basically produce, right, produce information on the policy actions and policy outcomes. Okay, so based on this understanding that what could be the sources of information for research and practice synthesis, now we are in a position to think about what would be the appropriate techniques for all the four approaches of monitoring that we discussed. Okay, so basically here in the last lecture we discussed about two types of approaches for the policy monitoring, and in this today's lecture we are discussing another two. So there are four approaches of monitoring. Out of these four approaches of monitoring that we discussed, social system accounting, social auditing, social experimentation, and the last one we discussed research and practice synthesis. The question is that what would be the appropriate techniques for all these four approaches of monitoring? So let's say that you are monitoring a particular scheme or policy or a task or a project, then which approach or which techniques you would like to adhere to for these approaches. So for example, for social system accounting, the available techniques that a monitor can use, it is in terms of graphic displays, okay, tabular displays, index numbers, interrupted time series, control series, but we cannot use this regression discontinuity and analysis. Okay, so likewise, let's say we are taking the case of social experimentation. This is the approach we are the monitoring agency is taking. Then the monitoring agency must be acquainted with that what are the appropriate techniques they can use for this approach. Okay, so the appropriate techniques that are commonly used for social experimentation is graphics displays, tabular displays, index numbers, right, time series, control series analysis, and also regression discontinuity analysis. So that means all the existing techniques can be applicable for the social experimentation. But if you see the last one, this research and practice synthesis, so only these two types of techniques are applicable for monitoring. So that is the graphic displays and tabular displays. So however, for research practice and synthesis, the use of index number or interrupted time series analysis, control analysis, and regression discontinuity analysis are not applicable. Okay, so this is not applicable. So 0 means here the techniques are not appropriate to a concerned approach, and this cross is the technique is appropriate to this corresponding approaches. Okay, so for example, what is this graphic displays? So I'll be taking an example of just one technique, then other techniques, I think it is the name is sufficient in the lower statistics and statistical analysis classes. So and also in case of econometrics classes as well, right? So all these are discussed. So I'll be just giving an example so that you can drag your past knowledge, right, to use to do analysis in terms of the other techniques as well. So what is this graphic display? So graphic display is nothing but a graphical or pictorial representation of the values that we are getting for one or more variables or actions or outcome variables. Okay. So that means this graphic displays can be helpful in depicting the variables that we are using, right, at one or more point time. So that means if it is in based on the time series, we can also graphically depict the same, and also we can summarize the relationship between two variables. Although it is very difficult to say that which one is cause and which one is effect, that means causal relationship is not possible here by graphic display, but yes, we can find out that there exists the relationship between the two variables. Okay, so in each case we can find that a particular graph displays a set of data points, and each of which can be identified by the coordinates of two numerical scales. So suppose say this is a typical graph that we can take, right? So x bar and y bar. Okay, so this is the 0 origin. So this is how we can find out that how coordinates can be taken into account, right, in numerical scale. So this is your plus, that means here all these are the positive numbers 1, 2, 3, and here it is 1, 2, 3. So this one is plus, okay, in a graph. So all the rest of the guidelines that is applicable for graphs, right, preparing graphs are also applicable for this graphic display. Okay, so for example, the horizontal scale of a graph is called axis scale and the vertical scale is called the ordinate. Okay, so this is and this is, okay. And when the graph is used to display causal relationship, then horizontal axis is reserved for the independent variable, that is x, and is called the x-axis, and the vertical one is displayed for the dependent variable y. So that means if this is the case, we are taking the x and y. So x is the x variable would be the independent variable, okay, and the y variable would be the dependent variable. Okay, so following this from the logic of our statistical systems, we can use this as well. And so likewise we can think about that in the policy context, since we are taking into account the main purpose of monitoring is to explain how policy actions can affect the policy outcomes. So in that case, we usually place input and process variables on the x-axis, that is independent variables. Okay, so that is what we are saying, that in the policy context, input and processes are independent. So they are usually depicted in x-axis, whereas the dependent variables like our output and impact variables, since they depend on the inputs and processes, so that is the reason they are known as the dependent variable, which are usually displayed in y-axis. Okay, so this thing that you need to take into account. So some examples of this graphic display can be your scatter plot, your bar graph, right, frequency polygon, histogram, and likewise. So you can find so many other graphical display, right, that you can use for the policy monitoring purposes as well. So these are some of the techniques that we can use for graphic display. Apart from this graphic display, we can find tabular display, index number, time series, control series analysis, and also the regression discontinuity analysis as the techniques that can be used for the policy monitoring. Okay, so lastly, we will be discussing what are the major concepts that are used in policy monitoring. Okay, so the major concept that we are using in policy monitoring is of 4 categories, I would say. The first one is the policy outputs. So what is this policy output? In the earlier classes, I told you that this when you are saying something that is output which is numbered, easily quantified. Okay, so that means policy outputs are the goods or services or monetary resources received by the target groups or the beneficiaries. Okay, so they are known as outputs. They are very tangible in nature. Okay, so for example, for this policy outputs we can take into account the per capita expenditures, because expenditure is quantified, it is numbered, and units of home food services received by the elderly households. Okay, so this units means the number of home food service received by the elderly household. This is also numbered, so that is the reason both the examples are the examples for your, both the cases are the examples of your policy outputs. So the second one is policy impacts. So what is policy impact? As I told you that the policy impact could be qualitative in nature, highly qualitative in nature, and sometimes it is quantitative. Okay, so but these policy outputs are quantitative in nature, policy impacts are highly qualitative in nature. So that is the reason it is difficult to measure in comparison to the policy outputs. So what is this policy impacts? So they are the changes in behavior or attitude, right, that is basically resulted from the policy outputs. Okay, so for example, the number of hospital beds per 1000 person. So what is the indicator? Indicator is the policy output, because it is easily quantified that because of the policy the number of hospital beds has been increased to 1000. Okay, hospital per 1000 persons, right? What is the number of hospital beds available? So let's say that per 1000 person the hospital beds are also 1000. Okay, so this is the indicator of the policy outputs, because this 1000 is numbered or is 1000 is quantified. But if you want to find what is the policy impact, right? So what should be your question, or how can you find out the policy impact of this particular policy that increasing the number of beds in the hospital? So the question could be, how many members of a particular target group, okay, or target communities are using the available hospital beds when they are falling sick. Okay, so that means it is related to their behavior and or attitude. So that means when they are falling sick, so how many are accessing that hospital and using the and utilizing the hospital beds. Okay, so since it is related to their behavior and attitude, right, so this is the policy impact. Okay, so the other two popular concepts that are used in monitoring is target group and beneficiary. So what is the target groups? The target groups are the communities or organizations or individuals on whom the policies and programs are designed to have an effect. Okay, so the policies and programs are designed according to the requirement of the individuals, organizations and communities, so that the policies and programs can have an effect on these target groups, okay, or target individuals. Okay, so they are known as the target groups. And what is beneficiary? So these beneficiaries are groups for whom the effects of the policies are beneficial or fruitful or valuable. Okay, so for example, we can think about the small medium enterprises. Okay, small and medium enterprises. So these are development of small and medium enterprises are the targets of the federal programs of our union government, but the workers and their families are the beneficiaries from these schemes. Okay, so I hope what is the difference between the target group and beneficiaries are understood, along with the concept that are used in monitoring purposes. So this is the reference. You can refer to chapter 6 of this book for the reading. Thank you.